Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I'd like to demonstrate that oneness is a practice that is for anybody, regardless of belief. If, as I said last week, the definition of oneness is like asking how long is a piece of string, if we were to try to encompass and wrap in all of the world's religions, we'd end up with a tangled ball of string and not really have any end on which to grab. And so we're going to strip that away and work with a secular definition and a way of working with oneness. A research paper published in 2019 by Laura Marie Ettinger-Schans looked at what would be the impacts of a belief in oneness on individuals. And one of the interesting findings was that despite the fact that a belief in oneness was more prevalent among those with a religious affiliation, it existed even still amongst those who identified as atheists. Ettinger-Schans provided her subjects with 5 statements to which they could rate their agreeableness, and nearly half of these statements had a distinct religious bent to them, one of them being, in fact, a question of belief in divinity. A reasonable hypothesis might be that had Ettinger-Schans controlled for the religiosity of those statements, there would have been very little difference in the prevalence of belief in oneness between those with a religious affiliation and those who identified as atheists. I think that there are 3 of her 5 statements that we can safely extract as being devoid of religious content. The first is that all things in the world have a common source. Now, whether you are looking at it from the scientific method or you look at it from a religious perspective, there is a common source. Science would say that the source was a dense and hot universe that gave way to matter, which gave way to life, which gave way to consciousness. Those with a more religious affiliation might say that consciousness predated matter and that all matter and life came from that consciousness, whether it is universal or divine. Whatever that common source is, it seems to be true that we all believe that there is a common source of all matter in the universe. The second statement that is safe to extract and include in our definition of oneness is a belief that everything in the world is connected. And finally, the third statement is that everything in the world is interdependent and influenced by one another. Those last 2 statements really are the definition that we talked through last time, with the exception that it goes a little bit further than interconnectedness into interdependence. If we want to remove any religious connotations or mystical woo-woo from the concept of oneness, then all of these 3 statements have a basis in the scientific method, whether it's looking at the interconnection and interdependence of living beings in ecosystems theory or of all matter in the universe through quantum theory. What does that have to do with gratitude? This is, after all, a channel about gratitude. But I would argue that it is when we feel deeply, profoundly grateful, when we sit with and savor those moments for which we're grateful, that is when we feel most interconnected and interdependent. That might be in terms of our relationships. It might be in terms of the natural world or our creative inspiration. It might be with respect to our society, or it might be something entirely more mysterious. I also believe that when we are experiencing and aware of our interconnectedness and interdependency, it is arising because of an event for which we can be grateful. In research by Garfield and colleagues, they went even further than we did, not only separating out religious concepts, but also differentiating between spiritual oneness and physical oneness. Physical oneness, as they defined it, is a belief that all phenomena in the universe are composed of the same thing and that they are ruled and governed by the same laws of nature. This sense of physical oneness led individuals to feel responsible for the natural environment of which they were a part. And so Garfield and colleagues saw that environmentalism was high amongst those who experienced a high level of physical oneness. But I would argue that oneness doesn't need to go that far to remain independent of religious thought. We aren't, after all, just physical matter. We are, in the words of physicist Richard Feynman, an atom that can contemplate another atom. Or we have human consciousness. And that consciousness allows us to perceive something more than just physical interconnectedness and interdependence. It allows us to perceive something more emotional, something more of the spirit, regardless of our beliefs. It's what creates those archetypes and myths that exist across cultures and through time. As David Attenborough has said, we are just one moment in a continuous span of life that goes back through time and onwards from us. It is, I think, this longing for consciousness to communicate with consciousness, this longing for love and connection that makes oneness so appealing to so many. We've all had that experience of being immersed in a beautiful piece of music and having that sense of almost becoming one with it, or the instrument, or the musician. We are so focused on that music that we lose track of time and ourselves, and that state is what is called a flow state. Not surprisingly, perhaps, there are many similarities between a flow state and a meditative state. In both states, we're required to have a high degree of concentration and focus. In both states, we eventually will lose track of ourselves, lose our self-consciousness, and perhaps what we might call ego consciousness. In both states, we become immersed in something greater than ourselves, and we lose track of time. It is through these meditative and flow states that we are able to experience a kind of spiritual oneness that goes beyond physical oneness. And the same things that keep us from achieving a flow state keep us from achieving a meditative state. If we are not practicing something that is at our skill level, then we will become bored and will lose our focus and concentration and not achieve a flow state. If we are practicing something that is too complicated, too beyond our skill level, then our mind becomes anxious and we can no longer concentrate and we lose our flow. And the same thing happens in meditation. If we haven't developed our ability to focus and concentrate, then the mind becomes anxious and fills us with thoughts. And it can become so disruptive that we become frustrated and give up meditating. Likewise, if we're not enthusiastic about practicing our meditation, we're likely to fall asleep. Whether we're trying to achieve a flow state or a meditative state, it's important that we practice in order to develop our skill level and that we challenge ourselves in order to maintain our passion. Now, last week I provided a resource list for meditation, and there are meditative practices that anyone can do, whether you are a person of faith, an agnostic, or an atheist. This week, I will leave in the description box some resources that will give you more information on how to achieve a state of flow. I chose to emphasize participation in the arts, but there are many ways in which you can enter a flow state. It could be through sports, or it could be through something like Tai Chi, or it could even be through video gaming. I hope that if meditation wasn't quite your cup of tea and you didn't enjoy the practices on the calendar, that you'll maybe look into other ways to achieve a flow state. It was, in fact, the link between meditative and flow states that got 𝐤𝐻𝐻𝐼𝐺 interested in understanding what the impacts on the individual would be of a belief in oneness. Several studies in positive psychology have already shown that the experience of interconnectedness and interdependence is linked to increased empathy, improved relationships, an increased tendency towards cooperation and altruism, and increased trust at the societal level. So what is it that 𝐤𝐻𝐻𝐼𝐺 found? A belief in oneness was linked to increased life satisfaction, and specifically to an increased level of keen interest in life, or what we might call joy, as we saw from last month. It was linked with increased happiness, a lower level of loneliness, lower levels of stress and anxiety, and overall, generally, better health, better academic performance, and increased longevity. And another interesting finding was that a belief in oneness was not an emotional state that came and went, but it was more of an attitude that tended to persist once it existed. And so we can assume that all of those benefits will continue to accrue throughout one's lifetime. As with all practices on this channel, there is a state of oneness, but there is also a trait level of our ability to achieve oneness. And Frederick Ullin and his colleagues looked at the Big Five personality test and compared that with individuals' ability to achieve a state of oneness. And they found that there were certain dimensions on the Big Five that were associated with a greater propensity towards the ability to enter into an experience of oneness. Now, as with all things, our awareness of our interconnectedness and our interrelatedness and our consciousness of oneness can be developed through practice, but it can also be developed by working to develop those personality traits that are associated with a greater propensity towards experiencing states of oneness. If you're a person of faith, I don't want you to think that I am discounting what you believe by removing the religious content from the concept of oneness. Now I invite you to add back your own perspective on oneness from your religion and add it to what we've discussed today. If you are curious about what different faiths believe about oneness, then I've created a playlist which includes some teachers from different traditions talking about oneness, and you'll find that link over my head now. As you continue to write down your 3 things for which you're grateful and 1 moment of joy, remember to mark down every day 1 moment of oneness. And I hope that as you go forward in life, you will continue to bring your awareness to our interdependence and interconnectedness, and that through the various practices I've talked about today and last week and on the calendar for March, you will continue to cultivate your consciousness of oneness. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, then click subscribe. If you want to know as soon as I've uploaded, hit the bell icon. For what are you most grateful today?